For thousands of years, architecture has been one of the most important parts of human culture. From ancient Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt, to ancient Greece, and ancient Japan, architecture has and is one of the most important parts of human culture and society.
An inventive style whose buildings almost seem to move and are known for sweeping curves and unusual materials. Jeffrey Brown catches up with Frank Gehry, now in his 9th decade, but still breaking new ground.
The man behind some of the most memorable structures in the world. Bill Whitaker introduces us to legendary architect Frank Gehry.
Frank Gehry is simply one of the great architects of our time.
The new Frank Gehry.
Frank Gehry does.
Frank Gehry is.
Frank Gehry.
Born on February 28, 1929, young Frank Gehry grew up in Toronto, Canada. He was constantly surrounded by a type of art called junk art, but Frank simply called it art. In the 1960s to 1970s, Gehry began to change or question traditional architecture. He would design buildings such as the Danziger Studio and the Gehry House, showcasing his inclination towards unconventional forms and materials. These were both put together through lines and curves and non-geometrical shapes to give off that they looked as if they were moving. It took Gehry around 20 or so years to decide what he wanted to do. Gehry's journey into architecture unfolded in the diverse landscape of Los Angeles, a city that brought up his architectural spirit. The 1980s marked a noticeable shift in architecture with the style known as deconstructivism. This was the exact opposite of the conventional norms of the 1960s and 70s. In 1997, Frank Gehry built the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. This became one of Frank Gehry's most famous buildings and a masterpiece in his era.
He sparked a movement that reinvented the architectural landscape of Los Angeles. He captured the imagination with his iconoclastic use of shape and form and material. His reputation and esteem extends across international waters. His latest project, the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao, will be completed this fall. Philip Johnson calls it, quote, the greatest building of our generation.
We asked Frank Gehry to build us a concert hall.
Bill. Snoopy Stationery.
Dear Mr. Gehry, would you please build a concert hall for our town? We may not be. We're the first city in America to abandon the metric system.
Frank Gehry, you're a genius. Behold, the new Springfield Concert Hall. And none of this would have happened if not for a letter I received from one little girl.
I wrote that letter.
You wrote I was the bestest architect in the world?
Well, aren't you?
All in favor of building a $30 million screw you to Shelbyville?
Aye!
Gehry's impact reached its way into something known as contemporary architecture. This, along with Japanese architecture, inspired Frank Gehry to build the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. He also built the Dancing House in Prague and the Biomoso in Panama City. Each building represents its own unique style. Moving into the 21st century, Gehry continued his pursuit of architecture. Even though new technology had come out and created sustainable designs, Frank Gehry still enjoyed his old ways with some help from the computers. His impact remains an unavoidable mark on the future of architecture.
I tell kids that, and I tell my students that they should not look over their shoulder, they should be themselves and find their own way, and that they will slowly realize that they will become the expert in their work, and that nobody else is an expert in their work, and that they will have, and so it doesn't matter what somebody else says. I mean, yeah, maybe they won't like it, but at least you're still in control, you're still the expert in your work. If you know what you're going to do in advance, then you won't do it. Your creativity starts with whether you're curious or not. Stood in front of a statue called the Charioteer. It's a Greek statue, it's in Delphi. Tall. And it was 500 BC. It made me cry. And I thought, boy, that's what an architect should do, is be able to have an emotional response with their work that lasts through the centuries. So that's what I try to do. Now, I know that's very pompous, but at least it's a wish.
It is definitely safe to say that Frank Gehry's creativity has changed architecture forever and will continue to change it, inspiring future generations to push beyond their capabilities and design in ways never seen before.